50 years ago this month, the queer patrons of the Stonewall Inn in New York decided to fight back against police brutality. Since then, this uprising has marked something of the mythic origins of the movement to secure rights for LGBTQ people. Considering this important anniversary, I wanted to do a special video for Pride Month. I have future plans for multiple videos on gender and sexuality in biblical texts, but for this video, I want to answer a single question. What does it mean for me as a queer person to read the Bible? I'm Katav, and this is Furmeneutics. I want to begin by making two caveats. First of all, note that I'm emphasizing what does it mean for me. This is my opinion, and my thoughts are not necessarily generalizable for all queer people or all biblical scholars. Every queer person's experience with the Bible is their own, and everyone has to figure out their own way of dealing with that experience. Second, I want to clearly state that no one has to read the Bible. Many queer people, like myself, have had the Bible wielded against them by conservative religious folk, and many of us bear the psychic scars of that abuse. If reading biblical text will cause you to relive some of that kind of trauma, then don't do that. Take care of yourself instead. If you think you might want to return to reading the Bible sometime in the future, that's fine. It will be there. In the meantime, if possible, give yourself time and permission to heal. So with those caveats, what does it mean for me as a queer person to read the Bible? For me personally, I can say that approaching biblical studies from an academic perspective was extremely helpful in dealing with the spiritual abuse that I experienced. In the fundamentalist tradition in which I was raised, my view of a text was regarded as a life and death, heaven or hell matter. But when I discovered the more grown-up discussions within biblical studies, suddenly I was exposed to a world where we could talk about issues of sexuality and gender without dire stakes like the fate of my eternal soul. In academic discourse, I found room for disagreement with conservative interpretations. I found the space for uncertainty and debate that I craved dearly. I found a critical perspective that allowed me to question what I had been told about myself. As a queer reader, I don't hold to any single authoritative interpretation of the Bible. I embrace diversity and ambiguity. Now, I'll be the first to say that by no means is biblical studies free from problematic assumptions about gender and sexuality. There are still a number of queerphobic biblical scholars, and many of them give their prejudices an air of respectability by translating their queerphobia into scholarly language. It's not great. But when scholarship is at its best, it gives us the tools to use critical thinking. So hopefully we can gain the know-how and the courage to challenge bigoted interpretations. And this brings me to another facet of how I read the Bible as a queer person. As I explored biblical studies when I was first figuring out my sexuality, as I read various scholars' interpretations and sorted through what I agreed with and what I disagreed with, I realized I could take ownership of these biblical texts. Let me explain. The Bible has a weird place in Western culture. For instance, no one says you can't read the Iliad because you're gay, or you can't read Plato because you're gay. My sexual orientation hasn't typically been a barrier to entry for discussions about other ancient texts, but with the Bible, it's different. American religious culture in particular has often relayed the message to queer people that the Bible is not for us, that in order to read it, learn from it, or critique it, we have to change who we are. Frankly, this is bullshit. You have every right to interpret these ancient texts. just as you have the right to interpret any other ancient text. And I would go further to say that we as queer people should feel free to interpret on our own terms. The past few decades have seen a number of books published by Christians and Jews that interpret biblical texts in pro-LGBTQ ways. And one of the trends in many of these books that I'm not particularly fond of is how defensive they can be. The main discussion point in these books is often the 6 or 7 verses in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament that can easily be read in queerphobic ways. Personally, I don't really enjoy structuring the terms of my engagement with ancient texts around a perceived need to defend my very existence as a queer person. If I accept this defensive posture as my default mode of reading, then I'm kind of ceding the ground of this debate to queerphobic, bad faith interpreters who aren't going to accept what I say anyway. You don't owe a defense to anyone. Instead, I'd rather take ownership of these texts and read them in my own way, without feeling the need to defend my existence. So if you want to read David and Jonathan or Ruth and Naomi as a queer couple, then by all means, do so. If you want to read the various eunuchs of the Bible as gender non-conforming people, then go for it. If you want to say that Jesus, because he's called the Lamb of God, is a furry, that's great. You have every right to live your life as queerly as you want, and you have every right to interpret the Bible as queerly as you want. Our social circumstances don't always afford us the safety to exercise this right. But in spite of what detractors may say, you do have a right to read queerly. And when biblical scholarship is at its best, it empowers us to critique cis-heteronormativity and to read these texts in new and exciting ways. Now, all that said, for many of us, there will come a point where we might need to do a little defensive work and actually try to account for the seemingly queerphobic verses in the Bible. Maybe you're part of a more conservative tradition, or maybe you're studying at a conservative school or seminary, or maybe you're talking through these issues with family, or maybe you're just curious and want to explore these issues for your own scholarship or religious practice. When I was coming out, one of the first things I did was download every article about homosexuality in the Bible that I could find on my university's journal database, and I read as much as I could. What I found was a great diversity of opinions, both about how the ancient text in question should be read in context, which is a scholarly question, and about how these texts might apply to modern religious people, which is a confessional question. I expected that many of those articles would be pretty negative toward queer people, and a number of them were. But I was delighted to find many scholars who were concerned with ethical treatment of queer people, and who wanted to read these problematic passages with more care and nuance. So, when biblical studies is at its best, it can help us sort through the many ways of reading texts like Leviticus 18 and 1 Corinthians 6. Texts which have been used to harm queer people. Biblical studies can help us understand the ancient patriarchal contexts of these passages and see how ancient peoples imagined the human condition differently than most Westerners today. As I studied these issues, I found that there were ways of reading these texts that could disarm them and defang them, that could make them no longer the slings and arrows I had experienced before. Biblical scholarship helped me to be a better queer reader of these texts as I learned to understand them more. So, what does it mean to read the Bible as a queer person? As I mentioned, if you don't want to read the Bible, then that's valid. But as I've learned to approach the Bible academically, I've come to see it as a text that I can take ownership of. A text that I have the freedom to read in my own queer ways. A scholarly approach to the Bible shows us that there is not one single answer to our questions about gender and sexuality, so we can find our place in the rainbow of diverse interpretations. Biblical studies has also given me the tools to think through the verses that have been used against me, to view queerphobic interpretations more critically, and to view the world around me more critically. If you're interested in reading more about queer interpretations of biblical texts, I provided a list of resources in the description below. This Pride Month, celebrate your queerness. Read the Bible as little or as much as you'd like. Be as queer with the Bible as you want. Be open to learning new things. Be willing to critique what you've been told. And get excited about building a more just world. Be gay and do crimes. Happy Pride, and thanks for watching.